Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight we're going to journey through one of history's most extraordinary stories, the rise and fall of the British Empire. For over 3 centuries, this small island nation ruled nearly a quarter of the world's land and governed almost a third of humanity. It was an empire so vast that the sun never set on its territories, stretching from the frozen shores of Canada to the burning deserts of Australia. But how did a rainy island off the coast of Europe come to dominate the globe? And why did this seemingly invincible empire eventually crumble into dust? Tonight, we'll explore the ambition, the brutality, the genius, and the ultimate hubris of the greatest empire the world has ever known. So settle in, dim the lights, and let me tell you the story of how Britain conquered the world and why it couldn't hold on to it forever. Every empire begins with a dream, and Britain's dream was born from water. Surrounded by the gray-green seas that both protected and imprisoned it, this small archipelago sat like a fortress off the coast of Europe, close enough to smell the smoke of continental wars, far enough away to watch them burn from a safe distance. In the early 1600s, Britain was hardly the master of anything beyond its own shores. It was a collection of fractured kingdoms, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, often at war with each other, frequently invaded by foreign armies, economically dependent on selling wool to Dutch merchants. The idea that this rain-soaked, fog-shrouded island would one day rule India, Australia, and half of Africa would have seemed like the fantasy of a madman. But the sea that surrounded Britain was not just a barrier, it was a highway. And the English, perhaps because they had no choice, learned to read that highway better than anyone else in the world. The transformation began with a single moment of defiance. In 1588, when the Spanish Armada, 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, sailed up the English Channel like a floating city of conquest, it seemed unstoppable. Spain was the superpower of the age, master of the Americas, controller of the world's silver mines, the sword arm of Catholic Europe. But the English had something the Spanish didn't expect: desperation married to innovation. Their ships were smaller, faster, more maneuverable. Opium production was nearly cost-free, yet it fetched exorbitant prices in Chinese markets. Consequently, millions of Chinese became addicted, and silver flowed from China to finance their habit. When the Chinese government attempted to prohibit opium imports to safeguard its populace from addiction, Britain initiated conflict to uphold the drug trade. The First Opium War, fought from 1839 to 1842, concluded with China being compelled to cede Hong Kong to Britain and to open 5 ports for British trade. The Second Opium War, from 1856 to 1860, forced China to legalize opium imports and to open even more ports. This represented imperialism at its most cynical, employing military might to coerce a sovereign nation into accepting a trade that was devastating its people. Yet, from the British viewpoint, it was merely business. Free trade was considered a moral good, and anyone who opposed it was viewed as obstructing progress and civilization. The same rationale was applied wherever the British flag was planted. In Australia, Aboriginal populations were displaced from their ancestral lands to accommodate sheep stations. In Canada, Native American tribes were confined to reservations to clear the path for railways and settlements. In Africa, traditional societies were disrupted to establish new markets for British goods and secure new sources of raw materials. However, the British did not perceive themselves as conquerors or exploiters. They regarded themselves as civilizers, bringing advancement and enlightenment to less developed peoples. They constructed railways and telegraph networks, established educational institutions and healthcare facilities, and imposed law and order on chaotic societies. The fact that these improvements primarily served British interests was, in their view, secondary. This encapsulated both the brilliance and the tragedy of the British Empire. It was simultaneously destructive and creative, oppressive and modernizing. The very system that impoverished millions also integrated them into the global economy. The same administrators who extracted wealth also developed infrastructure. The same soldiers who conquered territories also established peace among warring communities. By the mid-19th century, Britain had achieved something unprecedented in human history: global supremacy founded not solely on military conquest, but on economic and technological superiority. The empire was becoming self-sustaining, generating the wealth required to maintain the armies and navies that protected it. Nevertheless, this dominance rested on a foundation of contradictions that would eventually dismantle it. The greater the empire's success, the more it fostered the conditions for its eventual collapse. The educational systems it established produced colonial elites who comprehended both Western ideologies and local grievances. The economic development it promoted created new social classes with the resources to organize resistance. The communication networks it built enabled anti-imperial ideas to disseminate more rapidly than ever before. The empire was at its zenith, yet the forces destined to destroy it were already stirring in the background. Of all the territories under the Union Jack, none held greater significance in the British imagination than India. It was the jewel in the crown, the wellspring of Britain's prosperity and power, the validation of its civilizing mission. Yet, India also represented the empire's greatest paradox. A land of ancient wisdom governed by foreign merchants, a civilization older than Britain itself, reduced to colonial subjugation. The metamorphosis of India from a trading partner to an imperial possession was a gradual, almost unintentional process. The East India Company had initially arrived to trade, not to conquer. However, in a land where political authority was fragmenting and local rulers incessantly waged wars for territory and influence, the company discovered that military strength was essential to safeguard commercial interests. Each victory brought new responsibilities, new territories to administer, and new populations to control. The company's private army expanded from a few hundred European soldiers and Indian sepoys to over 200,000 men. Its territories grew from a handful of coastal trading posts to vast provinces encompassing millions of subjects. By 1850, the company controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, either directly or through puppet princes. It was a government operating under the guise of a business, an empire masquerading as a corporation. The company's shareholders in London received dividends from taxes paid by Indian peasants, while company officials in India amassed wealth through corruption and private trade. However, this system contained the seeds of its own demise. The company's rule was extractive and exploitative, designed to maximize revenue for shareholders rather than to promote the welfare of Indian subjects. Taxes were levied at oppressive levels, compelling peasants to cultivate cash crops for export instead of food for local consumption. Traditional industries were decimated by competition from British-manufactured goods. Famines became more frequent and deadlier, as the old systems of grain storage and distribution were dismantled. The company also meddled with Indian religious and social customs in ways that generated profound resentment. British officials, convinced of their own moral superiority, attempted to reform what they considered barbaric practices. They outlawed sasti, the practice of widow burning. They suppressed thuggee, the ritual murder perpetrated by certain criminal gangs. They constructed roads and railways that traversed sacred sites and disrupted traditional pilgrimage routes. These reforms were often genuinely humanitarian, yet they were imposed without consultation or consent. To many Indians, they appeared as assaults on their religion and culture, evidence that the British intended to convert them all to Christianity and obliterate their ancient way of life. The introduction of the Enfield rifle in 1857 provided the catalyst that ignited this accumulated resentment. The new rifle cartridges were rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, which was offensive to both Hindu and Muslim religious beliefs. When Indian soldiers were ordered to bite the cartridges to load their rifles, many refused. What began as a military mutiny rapidly escalated into a widespread uprising against British rule. The rebels proclaimed the restoration of the Mughal Empire and demanded the expulsion of all foreigners. For over a year, a significant portion of northern India was in revolt. British women and children were massacred at Kanpur. The siege of Delhi persisted for months. The siege of Lucknow became an epic tale of imperial heroism and horror. The British response was savagely brutal. Entire villages suspected of supporting the rebellion were razed to the ground. Rebels were blown from cannons or hanged from trees. The retribution was so merciless that it shocked even some British observers. General Neil's proclamation was characteristic. "The punishment I inflict is death, and I spare none." Yet, the rebellion also underscored the resilience of British rule. The majority of Indian soldiers remained loyal to the company. The princely states that had treaties with Britain largely stayed neutral or actively supported the British. The rebellion was confined to northern India, while the south and west remained tranquil. When the rebellion was finally quelled, the British government determined that the East India Company could no longer be entrusted with the governance of India. The Government of India Act of 1858 transferred control of India from the company to the Crown. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, and the subcontinent became the jewel in the imperial crown. The new system of government was more centralized and more efficient than the company's rule. However, it was also more distant and more authoritarian. The Indian civil service, recruited through competitive examination, provided professional administration. The Indian Army, reorganized with more British officers and fewer Indian soldiers, ensured security. The railway system expanded rapidly after the rebellion, contributing to both economic development and military control. However, the new Raj also engendered new problems. The civil service, though professional, was almost exclusively British. Indians were excluded from senior positions within their own government. The army, though effective, was an army of occupation designed to prevent rebellion rather than defend against foreign invasion. The railways, while economically beneficial, were primarily constructed to serve British strategic and commercial interests. Most significantly, the Raj cultivated a new class of educated Indians who comprehended both Western ideals and Indian grievances. The universities established by the British produced lawyers, doctors, teachers, and journalists who could articulate Indian nationalism using terms that the British themselves had taught them. Figures like Dadabhai Naoroji utilized British economic theories to demonstrate that British rule was impoverishing India. They estimated that Britain was extracting wealth from India at a rate of millions of pounds annually, leaving the subcontinent impoverished despite its abundant natural resources and diligent populace. Figures such as Bal Gangadhar Tala leverage British concepts of democracy and self-governance to assert that Indians possessed the inherent right to govern themselves. If the British championed representative government, then why should Indians not have their own representatives in their government? The Indian National Congress, established in 1885, initially sought only modest reforms within the existing imperial framework. Its early luminaries were moderate individuals who believed that gradual advancement was achievable through constitutional channels. They advocated for increased Indian representation in government, a greater presence of Indian officers in the military, and the safeguarding of Indian industries from British competition. However, the British reaction was largely unfavorable. The Raj showed no inclination to share power with Indians, even with educated Indians who had embraced British values and methodologies. Lord Curzon, Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905, epitomized the government's stance. Quote, "This viewpoint proved to be counterproductive. By refusing to accommodate moderate Indian nationalism, the British inadvertently ensured its progression towards radicalism. By treating all Indians as subjects rather than citizens, they fostered a collective identity among people who had previously identified themselves as Bengalis, Marathas, or Tamils rather than as Indians. The partition of Bengal in 1905 marked a pivotal moment. Curzon divided the province for administrative purposes, but Indians perceived it as a deliberate tactic to undermine Bengali nationalism by separating Hindus and Muslims. The ensuing public response was unprecedented. A boycott of British goods, which disseminated across India, was coupled with the first significant terrorist campaign against British rule. The Swadeshi movement, which promoted domestically produced Indian goods over British imports, demonstrated India's capacity for effective economic resistance. The terrorist attacks, though limited in scale, illustrated that some Indians were prepared to employ violence against British dominion. The British were compelled to reverse the partition in 1911, but the damage had already been inflicted. Indian nationalism had been radicalized. The First World War would accelerate this transformation. India made substantial contributions to the British war effort. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served abroad, and the Indian government provided hundreds of millions of pounds in loans and provisions. Indians were led to believe that they were battling for freedom and democracy, and that their fidelity would be recompensed with self-governance. Yet, upon the war's conclusion, the promised reforms were minimal. The Government of India Act of 1919 granted Indians a restricted role in provincial government, but retained factual authority in British hands. More distressingly, the Rowlatt Acts of 1919 conferred emergency powers upon the government to arrest and imprison Indians without trial. The consequence was the emergence of Mahatma Gandhi as the preeminent leader of Indian nationalism. Gandhi's brilliance lay in his fusion of Western concepts of civil disobedience with Indian traditions of non-violence and self-sacrifice. His methods were revolutionary, but his objectives were conservative. He aspired to purify Indian society, as much as to dismantle British rule. The non-cooperation movement of 1920 to 1922 witnessed millions of Indians withdrawing from British institutions. Students abandoned government schools. Lawyers boycotted British courts. Voters abstained from participating in elections. This represented the first mass movement in Indian history and underscored that British rule ultimately relied on Indian collaboration. The British response was inconsistent and contradictory. They oscillated between repression and concession, treating Gandhi alternately as a perilous revolutionary and a venerable figure with whom dialogue was possible. They never grasped that Gandhi's influence stemmed not from his personal charisma, but from his ability to articulate the aspirations of millions of Indians who had lost faith in British governance. By the 1920s, it became evident that the Raj was operating on borrowed time. The question was not whether India would achieve independence, but when and how. The British could postpone the inevitable through force and deception, but they could not avert it. The jewel in the crown was slipping from their grasp, and with it, the foundation of their global empire. By the 1870s, Britain confronted a novel and daunting reality: competition. For the majority of the 19th century, Britain had enjoyed what historians term the imperialism of free trade, the capacity to dominate global markets through superior industrial prowess and naval power, without the financial burden of formal colonization. However, other European powers were now catching up, and the accustomed world of British supremacy was eroding. Germany, unified under Prussian leadership in 1871, was rapidly industrializing and constructing a formidable navy. France, having recovered from its ignominious defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, sought to reinstate its prestige through colonial expansion. Russia was advancing southward towards India and eastward towards the Pacific. Even minor nations like Belgium were delineating colonial empires in Africa. The outcome was what historians refer to as the scramble for Africa, the most rapid and comprehensive colonization of a continent in human history. In 1870, Europeans controlled merely 10% of Africa. By 1900, they controlled 90%. It was a voracious pursuit of imperial ambition, with European powers annexing territory as swiftly as they could survey it. Britain's strategy was to secure the most valuable territories before its competitors could lay claim to them. The Cape Colony in South Africa commanded the sea route to India. Egypt controlled the Suez Canal, the shortcut to the east. Nigeria governed the palm oil trade. Kenya was strategically positioned at the headwaters of the Nile. Each territory represented a component in a global puzzle, valuable not solely for its intrinsic resources, but for its strategic placement within the imperial system. Cecil Rhodes, the diamond magnate who envisioned constructing a railway from Cape Town to Cairo, epitomized this new, aggressive imperialism. Rhodes believed that British expansion was not merely lucrative, but morally imperative, that the Anglo-Saxon race had a duty to civilize the world, and that an expansion of territory under British rule equated to greater happiness for humanity. The British South Africa Company, chartered in 1889, served as Rhodes's instrument for expansion. Like the venerable East India Company, it was a private corporation endowed with governmental authority, including the prerogative to forge treaties, maintain armies, and administer territories. The company conquered what would later become Rhodesia, expanding the empire by 500,000 square miles. Nevertheless, the scramble for Africa brought Britain into conflict with both European powers and African peoples, who had no intention of being colonized. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 endeavored to regulate the partition of Africa, yet it was essentially a mechanism for European powers to demarcate the continent without engaging in hostilities amongst themselves. The conference established the principle of effective occupation, that European claims to African territory necessitated substantiation through actual administration and control. This spurred a race to establish trading posts, sign treaties with indigenous chieftains, and plant flags in remote parts of the continent. The Africans themselves were not consulted. They were merely obstacles to be surmounted, or allies to be acquired. The human toll of this scramble was immense. The Congo Free State, established by King Leopold of Belgium, became synonymous with colonial barbarity. The Belgian administration employed forced labor to procure rubber and ivory, resulting in the deaths of millions of Congolese. The German suppression of the Herero and Nama peoples in southwest Africa constituted genocide by any definition, obliterating entire ethnic groups. Britain's record was not significantly better. The conquest of Sudan involved the systematic demolition of the Mahdist state and the massacre of its defenders at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Winston Churchill, who participated in the battle as a young cavalry officer, characterized it as the cause, quote, won. The Zulu War of 1879 saw British forces endure a devastating defeat at Isandlwana before ultimately quashing Zulu resistance at Ulundi. The war was ostensibly fought to safeguard British settlers, but its true objective was to dismantle the last independent African kingdom in southern Africa. Most challenging of all were the Boer Wars in South Africa. The Boers, Dutch-speaking farmers who had resided in South Africa for 2 centuries, had established independent republics in the Transvaal and Orange Free State. When gold was discovered in the Transvaal in 1886, British interest in the region escalated dramatically. The Second Boer War, fought from 1899 to 1902, proved to be Britain's most arduous colonial conflict. The Boers, fighting on their native soil with an intimate understanding of the terrain, emerged as formidable adversaries. They employed guerrilla tactics that thwarted British attempts at conventional warfare. The British response was to implement a scorched earth policy, incinerating Boer farms and confining civilians to concentration camps. Over 26,000 Boer women and children perished in these camps, primarily due to disease and malnutrition. It offered a preview of the total warfare that would define the 20th century. The war cost Britain £200 million and necessitated 450,000 troops to defeat 60,000 Boer fighters. It was a Pyrrhic victory that tarnished Britain's international standing and exposed the limitations of imperial power. The empire could still win wars, but only at an exorbitant cost, and through methods that appalled the civilized world. Concurrently in Asia, Britain confronted new obstacles to its dominance. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 had abbreviated the route to India, but it had also rendered the empire more susceptible to disruption. The canal was under the control of a French corporation, and France remained Great Britain's foremost competitor in the area. In response, Britain acquired a controlling interest in the Canal Company in 1875, financing this move with funds borrowed from the Rothschild banking establishment. This was a brilliant tactical success that granted Britain command over the world's most crucial waterway. But it also obligated Britain to defend Egypt, which oversaw the canal's southern terminum. The Egyptian crisis of 1882 compelled Britain to choose between its economic interests and its liberal values. A nationalist uprising, spearheaded by Colonel Ahmed Urabi, threatened to depose the pro-British government and nationalize the canal. Britain could have acquiesced to Egyptian independence, but this would have entailed forfeiting control over the route to India. Instead, Britain invaded Egypt and established a veiled protectorate that endured until 1956. The occupation was intended to be temporary, but temporary occupations often tend to become permanent. Egypt became another component in the imperial jigsaw, valuable not for its inherent worth, but for its strategic placement. This same pattern recurred globally. Britain acquired territories not due to a desire for them, but because it could not afford to allow other powers to possess them. The empire was gradually becoming a casualty of its own prosperity, forced to expand to safeguard its existing holdings. By 1900, the British Empire spanned 11 million square miles and governed 400 million people. It was the largest empire in human history, yet it was also progressively unwieldy and costly to maintain. The expense of defending so many territories was straining the British economy, while the intricacies of governing such a diverse populace were overwhelming the imperial administration. More ominously, the empire was fostering its own adversaries. Every act of expansion generated resistance. Every new territory brought new obligations. Every triumph created new susceptibilities. The empire, built on opportunism and pragmatism, was transforming into an inflexible system incapable of adapting to changing circumstances. The relentless acquisition of everything had bestowed the world upon Britain, but it had also provided the world with reasons to resent Britain. The empire was nearing its pinnacle, but the forces destined to dismantle it were already gathering momentum. In the mountainous and arid regions between the Russian and British empires, a different kind of conflict was unfolding. A war of espionage and diplomacy, of exploration and intrigue, of geopolitical maneuvers executed across thousands of miles of some of the Earth's most formidable terrain. This was the Great Game, the century-long struggle between Britain and Russia for dominance over Central Asia and influence over the approaches to India. The game commenced with apprehension. British officials in India, gazing north towards the towering peaks of the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas, perceived not natural barriers, but invasion routes. Beyond those mountains lay the vast Russian Empire, expanding southward with seemingly inexorable force. Every Russian advance into the Caucasus, into Central Asia, towards the borders of Afghanistan, was interpreted as a step toward the ultimate prize, India, the crown jewel of the British Empire. Russian officials, looking south from their fresh conquests in Central Asia, observed British influence extending northward from India like a slow-acting poison. British agents were active in Afghanistan, Persia, and Tibet. British gold was funding local rulers who might otherwise have been Russian allies. British maps were charting territories that Russia considered within its sphere of influence. Both empires were driven by an identical rationale. In a world where great powers vied for global supremacy, neutrality was impossible. Every territory not under one's control was potentially under an adversary's control. Their captains were pirates turned patriots, men like Francis Drake, who had learned to fight by stealing Spanish treasure. When the two fleets met in the narrow waters off the English coast, it wasn't just a battle between navies. It was a clash between two different ways of seeing the world. The Spanish fought like soldiers, trying to board enemy ships and engage in hand-to-hand combat. The English fought like merchants, staying at a distance, using their cannons to pound the enemy into submission. It was the difference between medieval chivalry and modern warfare, between honor and efficiency. When the storms came and scattered the Spanish fleet, the English claimed it was divine intervention. Perhaps it was. Or perhaps it was simply the first sign that the future belonged not to the largest armies, but to the most adaptable minds. The defeat of the Armada was more than a military victory. It was a psychological transformation. For the first time, the English began to see themselves not as a peripheral European kingdom, but as a potential maritime power. The sea, which had once been their prison, became their pathway to the world. Queen Elizabeth I understood this transformation instinctively. She began to encourage English privateers, legalize pirates, really, to raid Spanish treasure ships returning from the Americas. Men like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh became national heroes, bringing home Spanish gold and tales of distant lands ripe for conquest. But it was the establishment of joint stock companies that truly launched the British Empire. These were something new in the world. Private corporations with the power to wage war, sign treaties, and govern territories. They were capitalism armed with cannons, commerce backed by conquest. The Muscovy Company, founded in 1555, opened trade with Russia through the frozen Arctic seas. The Levant Company, established in 1592, traded with the Ottoman Empire, bringing back silk and spices from the mysterious East. Every local ruler who was not an ally was potentially an adversary's ally. The Great Game was not merely about territory. It concerned the balance of power in Asia and, ultimately, the world. The participants in this game were remarkable individuals. Soldiers, diplomats, explorers, and spies who operated in some of the most perilous and remote regions on Earth. On the British side, there were men like Alexander Burns who traversed Afghanistan and Central Asia disguised as a merchant, mapping territories and assessing the loyalty of local rulers. There was Arthur Connolly, who coined the term "Yond Alms," quote, and met a horrific end in a prison in Bukhara. There was Francis Younghusband, who led a military expedition to Tibet and compelled the Dalai Lama to sign a treaty opening the country to British influence. On the Russian side, there were men like Nikolai Przhevalsky, the explorer who mapped vast areas of Central Asia and Tibet while gathering intelligence for the Russian government. There was Mikhail Skobelev, the general who conquered the Central Asian Khanates with a blend of military brilliance and ruthless brutality. There was Count Nikolai Ignatiev, the diplomat who negotiated treaties that extended Russian influence deep into Asia. These men were playing for the highest stakes imaginable. If Russia could establish a secure route to the Indian Ocean, it would shatter Britain's naval supremacy and imperil the foundation of the British Empire. If Britain could establish a buffer zone of friendly states between Russia and India, it could safeguard its most valuable possession and maintain its global dominance. Afghanistan became the central battleground of the Great Game. This mountainous tribal country commanded the passes between Central Asia and India. Whoever controlled Afghanistan could threaten the other empire. But Afghanistan was also one of the most challenging countries in the world to subjugate and hold, a graveyard of empires where foreign armies met their demise. The First Afghan War, fought from 1839 to 1842, was a catastrophe for Britain. A British army of 16,000 men was virtually annihilated during the retreat from Kabul, with only one European survivor reaching the safety of British lines. The massacre stunned the British public and underscored the limitations of imperial power. But the British learned from their errors. The Second Afghan War, fought from 1878 to 1880, proved more successful. British forces occupied Kabul and compelled the Afghan ruler to accept a British resident and British control over Afghan foreign policy. Afghanistan became a buffer state, nominally independent but effectively under British suzerainty. The Great Game was not confined to Afghanistan. In Persia, British and Russian agents contended for influence over the Shah and his ministers. The country was apportioned into spheres of influence, with Russia dominant in the north and Britain dominant in the south. The Persian government, caught between two great powers, played them against each other while progressively losing command over its own territory. In Tibet, the British were apprehensive about Russian influence over the Dalai Lama. The Young Husband expedition of 1903 to 1904 forced its way to Lhasa and compelled the Tibetan government to sign a treaty excluding foreign influence and opening the country to British commerce. It was a brutal campaign waged at altitudes where men could barely breathe, but it secured Tibet as a British sphere of influence. The Great Game was also conducted through intermediaries and allies. The British supported the Emir of Afghanistan with funds and armaments, while the Russians supported various Central Asian rulers who opposed British expansion. Both empires exploited local conflicts to further their own interests, transforming regional disputes into episodes in their global rivalry. However, the Great Game was ultimately unwinnable. Neither empire could achieve a decisive triumph without risking a general war that might devastate both. The distances were too vast, the terrain too arduous, the local populations too hostile to foreign rule. Both empires were overextended, expending immense sums to maintain positions that were strategically significant but economically meritless. The game began to subside in the early 20th century as both empires confronted new challenges. Russia was weakened by its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 and by the Revolution of 1905. Britain was increasingly concerned about the burgeoning power of Germany and the necessity to deploy its forces closer to home. The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 formally concluded the Great Game by partitioning Persia into spheres of influence and acknowledging British paramountcy in Afghanistan. Both empires consented to respect the independence of Tibet, although this was largely inconsequential, as neither possessed the capacity to control it effectively. The Great Game had endured for nearly a century, and had cost both empires enormous sums of money and thousands of lives. It had introduced civilization to some of the Earth's most remote regions, but it had also brought war, exploitation, and cultural destruction. It had evinced the global reach of European imperialism, but it had also exposed its limitations. Most importantly, the Great Game had demonstrated that the era of effortless imperial expansion was drawing to a close. The world was filling with competing empires, and future conflicts would be more perilous and more destructive than anything that had transpired before. The British Empire had emerged victorious from the Great Game, but it had also learned that triumph in one theater might signify defeat in another. The empire was approaching its apex of extent and its pinnacle of vulnerability. The Great Game was over, but the greater game, the struggle for global dominance in the 20th century, was just commencing. By the mid-19th century, Britain had become something unprecedented in human history. a nation capable of manufacturing goods faster and more affordably than any competitor, then utilizing its naval supremacy to compel open markets worldwide. The industrial might of Manchester and Birmingham, with their smoking chimneys, powered the empire, generating the wealth that funded the armies and navies which conquered the world. This transformation was pervasive, evident everywhere one looked. England's green landscapes were giving way to red brick factories, and clear streams were blackened with industrial effluent. The ancient rhythms of rustic life were supplanted by the mechanical precision of factory systems. Britain was evolving into the world's workshop, and the world was becoming Britain's market. Steam was the fundamental force driving this metamorphosis. Steam engines extracted water from coal mines, enabling deeper excavation and increased coal output. Steam-driven textile mills produced fabric much faster than legions of hand weavers. Steam locomotives transported goods across the nation with unprecedented speed. Steam-powered vessels liberated Britain from dependence on wind and weather, allowing year-round navigation to every global corner. The statistics were astonishing. By 1850, Britain accounted for half of the world's iron production and two-thirds of its coal. British factories manufactured more cotton cloth than all other countries combined, and British shipyards constructed more ships than all other nations collectively. British merchants engaged in trade in every port, from Liverpool to Hong Kong. However, this industrial dominance came at a human cost that was almost immeasurable. The burgeoning factory towns were depicted as environmental and social abysses, plagued by pollution, overcrowding, and disease. Workers toiled 14 hours daily in conditions that would have appalled medieval serfs. Children as young as 6 worked in textile mills, their small fingers ideal for mending broken threads. Women working in match factories developed phosphorus poisoning, eventually leading to their demise, their faces glowing eerily. Friedrich Engels, who would later collaborate with Karl Marx on the Communist Manifesto, described Manchester's working-class districts as a hell upon earth. The air was thick with smoke and chemical fumes, and the streets were essentially open sewers. Entire families resided in single rooms, lacking windows or proper ventilation. Life expectancy in these industrial cities was half that of rural areas. Yet, this system, though exploitative, also offered a form of liberation. Factory workers, despite their dire conditions, experienced freedoms unknown to peasants. They could resign from their jobs, relocate to other cities, form unions, and demand better wages. The industrial system not only generated wealth, but also fostered the working class that would ultimately challenge the entire structure of capitalist society. The wealth amassed by British industry permeated the empire like blood through arteries. Raw materials flowed in from the colonies, cotton from India and America, wool from Australia, timber from Canada, and sugar from the Caribbean. These materials were processed in British factories and then sold back to the colonies as finished goods, yielding immense profits. This imperial trade system was enforced by the Royal Navy, which had become the most formidable fleet in human history. British warships patrolled all oceans, safeguarding British merchants and deterring potential rivals. The Navy's objective was straightforward: keep the sea lanes open for British trade and, when necessary, close to others. The Opium Wars with China perfectly illustrated the practical application of this system. The Chinese Empire, proud and self-sufficient, had little interest in British manufactured goods. While China possessed silk, tea, and porcelain, coveted by Europeans, it saw no need for European products in return. This created a trade imbalance that depleted British silver reserves. However, British merchants discovered one product that Chinese consumers desired: opium cultivated in British-controlled India. The drug trade proved incredibly lucrative. Opium was almost cost-free to produce, but commanded enormous prices in Chinese markets. Soon, millions of Chinese were addicted, and silver was flowing out of China to finance their habit. When the Chinese government attempted to prohibit opium imports to protect its populace from addiction, Britain resorted to war to defend the drug trade. This was imperialism at its most cynical, employing military force to compel a sovereign nation to accept a trade that was devastating its people. From the British perspective, however, it was merely business. Free trade was deemed a moral good, and anyone who opposed it was seen as hindering progress and civilization. The same rationale applied wherever the British flag was planted. In India, traditional textile industries collapsed due to competition from British machine-made cloth. In Africa, local ironworking was dismantled by inexpensive British imports. In Latin America, British merchants utilized their economic power to dominate markets, even in countries that were nominally independent. This economic imperialism frequently proved more effective than military conquest. Why expend resources on armies and administrators when the same outcomes could be achieved through trade? British goods were inherently superior and more affordable than local products. British capital could finance railways and telegraphs that opened new markets. British expertise could modernize less developed economies and enhance their productivity. Yet this system also generated its own paradoxes. The more prosperous British industry became, the more it fostered competitors. Other nations began to industrialize, leveraging British technology and capital to establish their own factories. Germany, the United States, and Japan all learned from the British example and began to challenge British supremacy. The educational systems established by Britain in its colonies produced local elites who understood both Western technology and local conditions. These individuals could organize resistance to British rule more effectively than traditional leaders who lacked modern knowledge. The railways and telegraphs built by Britain to control its empire also facilitated the faster spread of anti-imperial ideas. Most perilously, British industrial success was forging a new type of society, urban, literate, and politically aware, which became increasingly difficult to manage through conventional methods. The workers who operated the machinery generating the empire's wealth were also learning to form unions, political parties, and revolutionary movements. By the close of the 19th century, Britain's industrial dominance began to wane. Other nations were catching up, employing newer technology and more efficient methodologies. The workshop of the world was becoming just one workshop among many. The empire, built upon industrial supremacy, would need to discover new strategies to maintain its global standing. However, the mental habits forged by a century of industrial dominance were difficult to discard. British leaders continued to believe in their nation's inherent superiority, that their empire was a beneficent force in the world, and that their dominance was both inevitable and advantageous. This confidence would prove to be both their greatest asset and their fatal vulnerability in the challenges that lay ahead. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire had accomplished something unprecedented in human history. It governed nearly 400 million people across 11 million square miles, holding territories on every continent and in every ocean. The sun never set on the Union Jack, and British power seemed as immutable as the tides. However, this colossal empire was also becoming a burden, gradually overwhelming the nation that had created it. The expense of defending so many territories strained the British economy. The intricate task of governing so many diverse peoples overwhelmed the imperial administration. And the very triumph of the empire was fostering the conditions for its own collapse. The issue was not solely one of scale, though size undoubtedly played a role. How does one govern an empire stretching from Canada's Arctic tundra to Burma's tropical jungles, from Australia's sheep stations to South Africa's diamond mines? How does one formulate common policies for peoples as disparate as Scottish Highlanders and Indian peasants, Canadian lumberjacks and Egyptian fellahin? The British solution involved governing through a complex hierarchical system of different arrangements. Some territories like Canada and Australia were self-governing dominions with their own parliaments and prime ministers. Others, such as India, were directly ruled by British administrators. Still others, like India's princely states or Africa's protectorates, were governed indirectly through local rulers who accepted British oversight. This system functioned after a fashion, but it was incredibly costly and increasingly challenging to sustain. The Indian civil service required thousands of British administrators, all of whom had to be recruited, trained, transported, and compensated. The Indian Army necessitated hundreds of thousands of soldiers, both British and Indian, to maintain order and defend the frontiers. The Royal Navy required hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors to patrol the sea lanes and safeguard British commerce. The financial obligation was enormous. By 1900, Britain was allocating over 40% of its government budget to defense, most of which was for imperial purposes. The cost of the Second Boer War alone, £200 million, exceeded the entire annual budget of the British government just 50 years prior. However, the true burden of empire was not financial, it was moral and psychological. The British had convinced themselves that their empire differed from all preceding empires, that it was a force for good in the world, a civilizing mission that brought progress and enlightenment to backward peoples. This conviction was vital to their national self-image and their justification for ruling over so many others. Yet, the reality of imperial rule was frequently brutal and exploitative. The quelling of the Indian uprising in 1857 was marked by massacres and atrocities that deeply disturbed even seasoned soldiers. The subjugation of Sudan culminated in the slaughter of thousands of brave warriors at Omdurman. The concentration camps used during the Boer War resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of women and children. These contradictions generated a form of cognitive dissonance within the British psyche. They genuinely believed they were introducing civilization to the world, yet they were continually compelled to employ uncivilized methods to uphold their dominion. They championed the benefits of free trade while utilizing military might to open markets. They spoke of the rule of law while governing through emergency decrees and martial law. The onus of justifying these inconsistencies weighed heavily on the imperial administrators, soldiers, and settlers who confronted the daily realities of colonial governance. Many of them developed what Rudyard Kipling termed the white man's burden, a sense of duty and sacrifice that enabled them to rationalize their involvement in the imperial system. Kipling's poem, published in 1899, perfectly encapsulated this mindset. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. This was not cynical propaganda. It was a deeply held belief. Many British officials genuinely viewed themselves as servants of humanity, sacrificing their personal comfort and safety to bring order and progress to chaotic and underdeveloped societies. They constructed railways and hospitals, established schools and courts, and brokered peace among warring tribes and communities. However, this paternalistic stance was also profoundly racist and condescending. It posited that non-European peoples were incapable of self-governance, that they required British guidance to attain civilization, and that their own cultures and traditions were impediments to progress rather than valuable legacies to be preserved. This perspective was bolstered by the pseudoscientific racism prevalent in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Social Darwinism suggested that the British had evolved to a superior level of civilization compared to other races, making their dominance both natural and inevitable. Anthropology and ethnology provided what appeared to be scientific validation for treating different peoples as fundamentally distinct and unequal. The outcome was a system of racial hierarchy that permeated every facet of imperial existence. In India, British officials resided in separate cantonments, frequented exclusive clubs, and socialized solely with other Europeans. In Africa, white settlers were allocated the prime land, while Africans were confined to reservations. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples were regarded as a dying race, whose extinction was considered both unavoidable and desirable. This racial hierarchy was not merely a matter of social custom, it was enforced by law. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, known as the White Australia Policy, barred non-European immigrants from Australia. Analogous laws in South Africa restricted the movement and rights of the African majority. Even in Britain itself, informal but potent barriers prevented colonial subjects from achieving full equality. Yet, the empire was also forging the instruments of its eventual downfall. The educational systems established by the British produced colonial elites who comprehended both Western ideals and local grievances. Figures such as Mahatma Gandhi in India, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya were all products of British education, who subsequently turned that education against British rule. The communication networks constructed to control the empire, railways, telegraphs, steamship lines, also facilitated the faster dissemination of anti-imperial ideologies than ever before. Nationalist movements in various colonies could learn from one another, coordinate their actions, and present a unified front against imperial domination. Most significantly, The economic development fostered by the empire generated new classes of people with the resources and organization to challenge British supremacy. Indian merchants and industrialists, African mine workers, Caribbean sugar workers, all these groups developed their own interests that frequently clashed with imperial policy. By the early 20th century, the British Empire was akin to a vast machine operating smoothly, but demanding an increasing amount of fuel to sustain its functioning. The machine remained powerful, impressive, and capable of crushing any individual challenge to its authority. However, it was also becoming progressively more expensive to operate and increasingly difficult to justify. The burden of empire grew heavier with each passing year, and the British began to question whether the benefits outweighed the costs. The empire, once a source of strength, was transforming into a source of weakness, a commitment that Britain could neither abandon nor afford to maintain. The stage was set for the monumental crisis that would test the empire's resilience and expose its fundamental contradictions. That crisis would manifest in the form of two world wars that would deplete Britain's resources and erode its confidence in its imperial mission. When the guns of August 1914 began to thunder across Europe, few comprehended that they were witnessing the dawn of the end of the British Empire. The Great War, as it became known, would test the empire's strength as nothing had before, revealing both its remarkable fortitude and its critical vulnerabilities. Initially, the war appeared to demonstrate the empire's unity and might. From every corner of the globe, British subjects rallied to the flag. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa declared war on Germany within days of Britain's declaration. India contributed over 1 million soldiers to the war effort. Even the smallest colonies dispatched what they could, men, money, and materials, for the struggle against the Central Powers. The response was extraordinary. Young men from the wheat fields of Saskatchewan and the sheep stations of New South Wales marched off to fight in the trenches of France and Belgium. Indian regiments served on the Western Front, in Mesopotamia, and in East Africa. South African forces conquered German Southwest Africa. Australian and New Zealand troops landed at Gallipoli in one of the war's most renowned and tragic campaigns. However, this global mobilization incurred a cost that would ultimately prove fatal to the empire. The war cost Britain over £37 billion, exceeding the entire national wealth of the country at the war's outset. The national debt escalated by over 6%. Britain, once the world's creditor, became the world's debtor, owing colossal sums to the United States. More critically, the war shattered the myth of European superiority that had been central to imperial ideology. The civilized nations of Europe had torn each other apart with a savagery that appalled the world. Poison gas, machine guns, and artillery barrages had transformed the Western Front into a charnel house where millions perished for gains measured in yards. Colonial subjects, who had been told they were fighting for civilization and democracy, witnessed European civilization destroying itself. Indian soldiers who served in France sent letters home detailing the horrors they had observed. African porters who carried supplies for British forces in East Africa saw white men killing each other with industrial efficiency. The moral authority of the white race, already questionable, was further eroded by the spectacle of European self-destruction. The war also accelerated political shifts that had been developing for decades in India. The contribution to the war effort generated expectations of political reform that the British were hesitant to fulfill. And in 1600, the most important of all was chartered the East India Company. The East India Company's motto was simple, audacious, quote, audacious. But in practice, it was often the other way around. The flag followed trade. The company's first voyage to India in 1601 was a modest affair, 4 ships carrying English wool and hoping to return with Indian spices. But it marked the beginning of a relationship that would transform both Britain and India, making one the master of the world and reducing the other to colonial subjugation. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, English colonists were establishing footholds in the New World. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was a disaster. Most of the colonists died of disease and starvation. The settlement survived by the thinnest of margins, sustained by tobacco cultivation and the brutal exploitation of enslaved Africans. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 were fleeing religious persecution, not seeking empire. But they carried with them something more powerful than armies: the English language, English law, and English ideas about property, government, and individual rights. These ideas would spread across the continent like seeds on the wind, taking root in soil that had never known European civilization. By 1650, England had established colonies in Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, and the Caribbean islands of Barbados and Jamaica. These were not yet the jewels of a global empire. They were struggling settlements on the edge of the known world, constantly threatened by disease, starvation, and hostile neighbors. But they represented something unprecedented, the systematic colonization of distant lands by a European power. The Spanish had conquered vast territories in the Americas, but they had done so primarily to extract gold and silver. The English were different. They came to stay, to build new societies, to recreate England in foreign lands. This difference would prove crucial to the empire's eventual success. Spanish colonies remained dependent on the mother country, existing primarily to enrich Spain. English colonies, by contrast, developed their own economies, their own institutions, their own identities. They became extensions of England, not merely possessions of it. The Government of India. Act of 1919 granted Indians a limited role in provincial government, but fell far short of the self-governance many had anticipated as a reward for their loyalty. The Rowlatt Acts of 1919, which empowered the government to arrest and detain Indians without trial, seemed to confirm that British promises of reform were hollow. The response was the emergence of Mahatma Gandhi as the leader of Indian nationalism, advocating his revolutionary doctrine of non-violent resistance. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre of April 13, 1919, marked a pivotal moment in British-Indian relations. General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to open fire on an unarmed crowd gathered in a walled garden in Amritsar, killing at least 379 people and wounding over 1,000. Dyer's actions were defended by many British officials as necessary to maintain order, but they outraged Indian opinion and annihilated any remaining Indian faith in British justice. The massacre exposed the grim reality beneath the rhetoric of imperial benevolence. When confronted with a challenge to their authority, the British were prepared to employ the same methods as any other imperial power. Overwhelming force applied without mercy or discrimination. The das, quote, estais, waspas, was revealed as a thin veneer over the iron fist of military rule. Similar patterns unfolded across the empire. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 had been suppressed with brutal efficiency, but it also generated a new generation of nationalist martyrs. The execution of the Rising's leaders transformed them into heroes and galvanized Irish opinion against British rule. The Irish War of Independence, fought from 1919 to 1921, concluded with the partition of Ireland and the establishment of the Irish Free State. In Egypt, the Revolution of 1919 compelled Britain to grant nominal independence in 1922, though British forces remained to safeguard the Suez Canal. In Iraq, a major rebellion in 1920 necessitated massive military intervention to quell. Even in the Dominions, there were indications of burgeoning independence. Canada's signing of the Treaty of Versailles, independently of Britain, underscored its assertion of sovereignty in foreign policy. The war had also exposed the empire's strategic weaknesses. The German U-boat campaign brought Britain to the brink of starvation by disrupting the vital sea lanes connecting the empire. The vulnerability of the Suez Canal highlighted how easily the route to India could be severed. The Japanese alliance, crucial for safeguarding British interests in the Pacific, grew increasingly unreliable as Japan pursued its own imperial ambitions. Most concerningly, the conflict accelerated the emergence of new global powers challenging British supremacy. The United States had ascended to become the world's preeminent industrial and financial power. The Soviet Union, despite internal turmoil, presented a novel ideological challenge to the imperial framework. Japan was consolidating its dominance in East Asia. Germany, though vanquished, retained its industrial capacity to once again confront Britain. The British reaction to these challenges was inconsistent and contradictory. Some officials, like Winston Churchill, believed that the empire could be preserved through sheer force and determination. Others, such as economist John Maynard Keynes, contended that the economic underpinnings of the empire were eroding and that Britain needed to discover new avenues to maintain its global influence. The Washington Naval Conference from 1921 to 1922 symbolized Britain's diminishing stature. For the first time in over a century, Britain consented to naval parity with another nation, the United States. The Royal Navy, which had been the cornerstone of British power for 3 centuries, was no longer supreme. The empire that emerged from the Great War, though still vast and formidable, was fundamentally transformed. The easy confidence of the Victorian era had vanished, replaced by a growing awareness of the empire's limitations and susceptibilities. The war had been won, but at a cost that raised doubts about the empire's ability to withstand another such ordeal. The foundational crack had appeared, destined to widen over time. The British Empire had reached its zenith in terms of territorial extent. The pink on the map would never be more extensive than it was in the 1920s. Yet, the forces that would eventually dismantle it were already gathering momentum, and the subsequent major crisis would reveal the profound fragility of the world's largest empire. The 1920s and 1930s represented the empire's Indian summer, a period of apparent stability and continued expansion that concealed the fundamental alterations gradually eroding British power. Superficially, the empire seemed as robust as ever. The map remained colored pink, from Canada to Australia, from India to South Africa. British administrators still governed hundreds of millions of subjects. The Royal Navy continued to patrol the world's oceans. Nevertheless, beneath this veneer of strength, the empire was slowly disintegrating. The economic foundations of British power were crumbling. The moral authority underpinning imperial rule was being called into question, and new forces, nationalism, communism, fascism, were challenging the entire imperial system. The economic crisis posed the most immediate threat. The Great War had transformed Britain from a global creditor to a global debtor. The nation owed enormous sums to the United States, and interest payments alone consumed a significant portion of the government budget. The pound sterling, which had served as the world's reserve currency for over a century, was under relentless pressure. British industry, once dominant in global markets, was losing ground to competitors in the United States, Germany, and Japan. The traditional staple industries, textiles, coal, steel, shipbuilding, were in decline, unable to compete with more modern and efficient producers. Unemployment was chronic, peaking at over 3 million during the worst years of the Depression. The empire, once a source of wealth, was becoming an expensive burden. The cost of defending India alone consumed over half of Britain's defense budget. The dominions were increasingly unwilling to contribute to imperial defense, preferring to allocate their funds to domestic priorities. The colonies, which had once provided captive markets for British goods, were developing their own industries and reducing their reliance on British imports. The political challenges were even more profound. Across the empire, nationalist movements were gaining strength and sophistication. In India, the Indian National Congress had evolved from a moderate organization seeking gradual reform to a mass movement demanding complete independence. Mahatma Gandhi's campaigns of civil disobedience demonstrated that the Raj could be resisted through non-violent means. The Salt March of 1930 was a masterpiece of political theater. Gandhi's 300-mile walk to the sea to make salt in defiance of the British monopoly captivated global attention and exposed the moral bankruptcy of imperial rule. How could the British justify the arrest of an elderly man for producing salt from seawater? The Government of India. Act of 1935 attempted to address Indian demands through a complex system of provincial autonomy and federal government. However, it was too little, too late. The act satisfied neither British conservatives, who viewed it as a dangerous concession to Indian nationalism, nor Indian nationalists, who saw it as an attempt to divide and rule. Similar trends were emerging throughout the empire. In Burma, the nationalist movement was gaining momentum under leaders like Aung San. In Ceylon, Sri Lanka, the Donomore Constitution of 1931 granted limited self-government but failed to appease nationalist aspirations. In the Middle East, the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 challenged British rule in Palestine, while nationalist movements in Egypt and Iraq demanded greater independence. Even in the dominions, there were signs of increasing autonomy. The Balfour Declaration of 1926 recognized the dominions as equals to Britain rather than subordinates, fundamentally altering the nature of the imperial relationship. The Statute of Westminster of 1931 granted the dominions complete legislative independence, effectively dissolving the legal unity of the empire. The rise of fascism and communism presented new ideological challenges to the imperial system. The Soviet Union offered an alternative model of development that resonated with many colonial subjects, particularly intellectuals and workers who had been excluded from the benefits of imperial rule. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany directly challenged British power, threatening the Mediterranean route to India and the security of the empire's African territories. The Abyssinian crisis of 1935 revealed the empire's weakness in the face of determined aggression. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, Britain was unable to take effective action to stop him. The League of Nations imposed sanctions, but they proved ineffective without American and German participation. The crisis demonstrated that Britain could no longer act as the world's policeman without the support of other major powers. The Munich crisis of 1938 underscored the extent of British power's decline. Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement was not merely a moral failing, it was an acknowledgement of Britain's inability to fight a major war without allies. The empire that had once been capable of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously was now struggling to defend its own homeland. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. Unlike the First World War, which was primarily fought in Europe, this was a truly global conflict that would test every facet of imperial power. The early years of the war were catastrophic for British prestige. The fall of France in June 1940 left Britain alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain safeguarded the homeland from invasion, but it also exposed how vulnerable the empire had become. The Blitz demonstrated that British cities could be bombed with impunity, shattering the myth of invulnerability that had been central to imperial ideology. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States into the war, but it also brought Japan into conflict with the British Empire. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 was perhaps the most devastating blow to British prestige in the empire's history. The supposedly impregnable fortress succumbed to a Japanese army that was purportedly inferior to European forces. The surrender of over 100,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops at Singapore shattered the myth of white superiority that had been central to imperial rule. If the British could not defend their own territories against an Asian power, how could they claim to be the natural rulers of Asia? The Japanese conquest of Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and much of the Pacific indicated that the era of European imperialism was drawing to a close. The old empires were being swept away by new forces that they could neither comprehend nor control. The British Empire, which had appeared so permanent and powerful just a few decades earlier, was revealed to be as mortal as any other human institution. The war would ultimately be won, but at a cost that would make the continuation of the empire impossible. The Britain that emerged from the Second World War would be a vastly different nation from the one that entered it, bankrupt, exhausted, and reliant on American support for its very survival. The twilight of the gods had commenced, and no dawn would follow. The Second World War was the British Empire's last great victory and its ultimate defeat. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, Britain stood among the victors, its flag still flying over vast territories, its prestige seemingly intact. Yet, the war had drained the empire's lifeblood, leaving it a hollow shell that would crumble within a generation. The statistics painted a clear picture of imperial exhaustion. Britain had expended over £28 billion on the conflict, a sum exceeding the nation's entire wealth in 1939. The national debt had escalated threefold. The country's gold reserves vanished, consumed by American armaments and provisions. Having entered the war as a creditor, Britain emerged as the world's foremost debtor. More devastating than the financial toll was the human cost. Over 450,000 British and Commonwealth military personnel perished in the war. Entire urban centers lay in ruins, reduced to rubble by German aerial assaults. The merchant marine, the empire's vital artery, suffered the loss of over 30,000 men and 4,000 vessels due to enemy actions. However, the true damage was psychological. The war had shattered the myth of British invincibility, a cornerstone of imperial governance. The fall of Singapore, the retreat from Burma, and the near collapse of the Middle Eastern position all demonstrated that the British were not the unconquerable race they had purported to be. Colonial subjects, who had been told they were fighting for freedom and democracy, took these declarations seriously. Indian soldiers, having served in Burma and Italy, returned home with fresh perspectives on their rights and capabilities. African soldiers, who had seen service in the Middle East and Far East, came back with an expanded understanding of the world and their place within it. The war also accelerated societal and political transformations that rendered the old imperial system untenable. The Labour Party's triumph in the 1945 election brought to power individuals who viewed the empire with skepticism and prioritized domestic social reform. Clement Attlee, the incoming prime minister, had long considered the empire an expensive anachronism that diverted resources from national priorities. The new government was confronted with an impossible choice: uphold the empire or reconstruct Britain. The nation simply lacked the resources to undertake both. This decision was facilitated by the burgeoning strength of nationalist movements across the empire and the diminishing strategic importance of many imperial territories. India represented the initial and most significant collapse. Both the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League had supported the war effort, yet they did so with the understanding that independence would follow victory. When the war concluded, they were unwilling to wait any longer. The cabinet mission of 1946 sought to devise a formula for Indian unity, but the escalating animosity between Hindus and Muslims rendered this impossible. The demand for Pakistan, a distinct state for the subcontinent's Muslims, could not be disregarded. Partition became unavoidable, despite its horrific human toll. Lord Mountbatten, India's final viceroy, was assigned the arduous task of orchestrating the transfer of power while maintaining order. The partition of India in August 1947 was accompanied by sectarian violence that claimed over 1 million lives and displaced an additional 12 million. It was a tragic conclusion for the jewel in the crown, yet it also acknowledged that the era of empire had ended. The loss of India triggered a cascade of independence movements throughout the empire. Burma gained independence in January 1948, followed by Ceylon in February. Palestine, rendered ungovernable by the conflict between Jews and Arabs, was ceded to the United Nations in May 1948. This pattern was replicated across Africa and Asia. Ghana achieved independence in 1957, followed by Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, and dozens of other territories in subsequent decades. By the 1970s, the British Empire had dwindled to a handful of small islands and territories, too diminutive or remote to attain viable independence. The process of decolonization was not uniformly peaceful. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, the Malayan emergency, the Cyprus crisis, and the Suez debacle all demonstrated Britain's willingness to fight to preserve its empire, but they also revealed that such struggles were ultimately futile. The Suez Crisis of 1956 arguably represented the most humiliating nadir in the empire's decline. When Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France launched a military intervention to reclaim control. The operation achieved military success, but proved to be a political catastrophe. Both the United States and the Soviet Union condemned the intervention, forcing Britain to withdraw in ignominy. Suez exposed Britain's inability to act as a major power without American backing. The special relationship with the United States forged during the war transformed into one of dependence rather than partnership. Britain was relegated to the role of America's junior partner, a position many found difficult to reconcile with. The economic underpinnings of the empire were also crumbling. The sterling area, the empire's financial bedrock, was undermined by recurring currency crises. The pound was devalued in 1949 and again in 1967. The decision to float the pound in 1972 signaled the end of sterling's role as an international reserve currency. British industry, once dominant in global markets, was losing ground to rivals in Germany, Japan, and the newly industrializing nations of Asia. The erstwhile imperial markets were no longer captive. Former colonies were at liberty to trade with whichever entity offered the most favorable terms. The Commonwealth, intended to sustain economic ties between Britain and its former colonies, became little more than a forum for discussion. By the 1970s, it was unequivocally clear that the British Empire was finished. The pink areas on the map had faded to a few scattered dots. The Royal Navy, once master of the seas, was reduced to a coastal defense force. The nation that had once governed a quarter of the world's populace was struggling to govern itself. The empire's demise was not marked by a single cataclysmic event, but by a gradual realization that the age of European imperialism had concluded. The forces that had forged the empire, industrial supremacy, naval dominance, technological advantage, had proliferated globally. Other nations could now accomplish what Britain had once done uniquely well. The reckoning had arrived, and it was conclusive. The greatest empire in human history had endured for less than 4 centuries, a fleeting moment in the vast expanse of human history. It had reshaped the world, for better and for worse. But it had also transformed itself out of existence. The British Empire was defunct, yet its legacy would persist in the language, laws, and institutions it had propagated worldwide. The question now was, what would assume its place in the global order it had brought into being? Today, walking through the streets of London, one can still discern the spectral presence of empire everywhere. The imposing edifices of Whitehall, where the colonial office once governed a quarter of the globe. The monuments to imperial heroes in Trafalgar Square and Parliament Square. The museums filled with treasures plundered from every corner of the earth. The very names of the streets, India House, Australia House, Canada House, evoke a time when London served as the world's capital. But the empire itself is gone, as utterly vanished as the Roman legions or the Mongol hordes. The pink has receded from the map, replaced by the banners of independent nations. The Royal Navy, which once commanded the waves, has been diminished to a mere handful of vessels. The country that once held sway over 400 million people now contends with governing 67 million. Yet the empire's legacy endures in both perceptible and imperceptible ways, beneficial and detrimental. The English language, spread by imperial conquest and commerce, has become the global lingua franca. The legal systems of dozens of countries are founded upon English common law. The parliamentary democracy pioneered in Westminster has been adopted, with adaptations across the globe. The economic system birthed by the empire, global capitalism predicated on free trade and the flow of capital, has emerged as the dominant paradigm for human organization. The communication networks constructed to control the empire have evolved into the internet that connects the world. The scientific and technological advancements that provided Britain its imperial advantage have become the shared inheritance of humanity. However, the empire's legacy is not entirely benign. The arbitrary borders delineated by imperial administrators have become founts of conflict, from the Middle East to Africa. The racial hierarchies established to legitimize imperial rule have left profound scars on societies globally. The economic exploitation that enriched Britain left many of its former colonies impoverished, creating patterns of underdevelopment that persist to this day. The partition of India, the genesis of Israel, the artificial states of Africa, all bear the imprint of imperial decision-making that prioritized British interests over local realities. The ramifications of these decisions continue to shape global politics, generating conflicts that have endured for generations. Perhaps most significantly, the British Empire established the blueprint for modern globalization, the integration of the world economy, the movement of people and ideas across national boundaries, and the creation of international institutions. All these have their genesis in the imperial system that Britain forged. But the empire also illustrated the limitations of power and the inevitability of change. Regardless of how dominant an empire becomes, no matter how permanent it appears, it carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Success breeds complacency, expansion leads to overstretch, and the very forces that create empire eventually turn against it. The British learned this lesson the hard way. Their empire crumbled not due to a single catastrophic defeat, but because of a gradual erosion of the foundations of their power. Economic decline, military overextension, nationalist resistance, and shifting global conditions all combined to render the empire unsustainable. The identical forces that annihilated the British Empire are at play today. The United States, having assumed the mantle of the world's leading power from Britain, confronts many of the identical challenges that ultimately led to its predecessor's decline. Economic rivalry from ascending nations, global military obligations, domestic political rifts, and evolving international norms collectively imperil American supremacy. China, which endured over a century of British imperialism, is now emerging as a potential successor to American dominance. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's ambitious undertaking to link Asia, Africa, and Europe through infrastructure investment, strikingly resembles the imperial networks that once connected the British Empire. However, the global landscape has transformed since the era of European imperialism. The outdated methods of control, military conquest, economic exploitation, and racial hierarchy are no longer acceptable or efficient. Modern empires must be constructed on alternative foundations: economic integration, technological innovation, cultural influence, and international cooperation. The British Empire was a product of its time, shaped by the distinct conditions of the 18th and 19th centuries. It could not have materialized without the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, and the specific balance of global forces that afforded Britain its temporary advantage. That world has vanished, and it will not reappear. The future belongs to different organizational forms, distinct modes of exercising power, and varied relationships among peoples and nations. The English also proved more adaptable than their rivals. Where the Spanish imposed their culture and religion on conquered peoples, the English were more pragmatic. They were willing to work with local rulers, to adopt local customs when it suited them, to govern indirectly through existing power structures. This pragmatism was born of necessity. England simply didn't have the resources to impose direct rule on vast territories, but it became a source of strength, allowing the English to control far larger areas with far fewer soldiers than their competitors. By the end of the 17th century, the foundations of the British Empire were in place. The Royal Navy was becoming the most powerful fleet in the world. English merchants were trading in every ocean. English colonists were spreading across North America and the Caribbean. And the East India Company was beginning its conquest of India. The stage was set for the greatest expansion in human history. But first, Britain had to become Britain. In 1707, something remarkable happened in the corridors of power in London and Edinburgh. Two ancient enemies, England and Scotland, decided to become one nation. The Act of Union created Great Britain, and with it, the political foundation for the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But this union was not born of love or shared identity. It was born of calculation, desperation, and mutual need. Scotland, bankrupted by a disastrous attempt to establish its own colony in Panama, needed English money. England, facing the prospect of a hostile Scotland allied with France, needed Scottish loyalty. The marriage was arranged like a business transaction, negotiated in smoke-filled rooms by men who understood that sentiment was a luxury they could not afford. Scottish nobles were bribed with English gold. The age of empire has concluded, yet the human impetus to establish order, forge connections, and exert influence across vast distances persists. The British Empire represented both the pinnacle achievement and the profound tragedy of the modern era. It unified the world as never before, disseminating ideas, technologies, and institutions that have benefited all humanity. Yet, it also exploited and oppressed millions, creating racial and national hierarchies that have poisoned human relations for generations. Comprehending this history is crucial for understanding our contemporary world. The global economy, the international system, and the patterns of development and underdevelopment that define our world today all have their roots in the imperial age. We cannot grasp our current position without understanding our origins. The British Empire is defunct, but its specters still wander amongst us. They whisper in the languages we speak, the laws we observe, and the institutions we inhabit. They serve as a reminder that all human accomplishments are transient, that all empires rise and fall, and that the sole constant in history is change itself. The sun has finally set on the British Empire, but it has dawned on a new world that the empire contributed to creating. Whether that world will prove superior or inferior to what came before remains to be seen. However, one certainty stands. The age of empire is over, and the age of something else has commenced. The narrative of the British Empire chronicles human ambition and human folly, of monumental achievements and horrific crimes, of the ascent and decline of civilizations. It is a story that reminds us of both the possibilities and the limitations of human power. In the end, perhaps that is the most crucial lesson of all, that no empire, irrespective of its grandeur, is eternal. The British assimilated this lesson, as the Romans did before them, and as the Americans may learn it in their turn. Power is ephemeral, but the human story endures. The British Empire conquered the world, but ultimately, the world conquered the British Empire. And within that conquest, perhaps lies the seed of a brighter future for all humanity. English politicians were promised Scottish support, and the common people of both nations were largely ignored. Yet from this cynical beginning emerged something extraordinary. The union of England and Scotland created a new kind of nation, one that was simultaneously ancient and modern, traditional and innovative, conservative and revolutionary. It was a nation that could draw on the commercial genius of England and the intellectual brilliance of Scotland, the naval traditions of the South, and the military prowess of the North. The Scots, who had been England's enemies for centuries, became the empire's most enthusiastic builders. Scottish engineers built the roads and bridges that connected the empire. Scottish doctors and teachers spread across the colonies, bringing education and medicine to the farthest corners of the world. Scottish soldiers fought in every imperial war, their kilts and bagpipes becoming symbols of British power from the Highlands to the Himalayas. But the Union also created something darker, a sense of racial and cultural superiority that would justify centuries of exploitation and oppression. The British began to see themselves not just as successful, but as inherently superior to other peoples. They were Protestant in a Catholic world, civilized among barbarians, free among slaves. This sense of superiority was reinforced by the Enlightenment, the great intellectual movement that swept through 18th century Britain. Theories concerning economics, politics, and society, articulated by thinkers such as Adam Smith, David Hume, and Edmund Burke, appeared to clarify British success and legitimize its expansion. Adam Smith's Nafarns, quote, Noe Sires, published in 1776, posited that unrestricted trade and competition would naturally foster prosperity and advancement. This doctrine became the intellectual cornerstone for British economic imperialism, promoting the notion that opening global markets to British products was not merely lucrative, but morally advantageous for all humanity. Edmund Burke's treatises on governance and societal structures provided a philosophical justification for British dominion over less developed populations. Burke contended that the British bore a responsibility to govern those deemed incapable of self-governance, thereby bringing civilization to the uncivilized and imposing order upon disorder. These concepts transcended mere academic discourse, evolving into the operational principles of the British Empire. Every act of conquest was rationalized as a civilizing mission, every instance of exploitation as economic advancement, and every oppression as necessary discipline. However, the true impetus behind British expansion was not philosophy, but warfare. The 18th century was characterized by almost incessant conflict as European powers vied for supremacy across Europe, America, and Asia. During these wars, Britain unearthed its paramount advantage, the capacity to engage on multiple fronts concurrently, while its adversaries were spatially constrained. The 7 Years' War, waged from 1756 to 1763, represented humanity's inaugural truly global conflict. It unfolded across 3 continents and every ocean, stretching from the North American forests to the Indian plains, and from the Caribbean islands to the African coasts. In North America, British and colonial forces successfully captured Quebec and Montreal, thereby terminating French rule in Canada. The demise of General James Wolfe on the Plains of Abraham entered legend, depicting a youthful hero perishing at the moment of triumph, his final reported utterance being, "Now God be praised, I will die in peace." In India, Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 conferred control over Bengal, the subcontinent's wealthiest province, to the East India Company. This battle was secured not through superior tactics, but through superior corruption, as Clive had bribed the enemy's generals to defect at the critical juncture. In the Caribbean, British forces seized the French sugar islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, augmenting the burgeoning imperial treasury. In Africa, British traders established new outposts along the coastline, fueling the escalating demand for enslaved labor in the American colonies. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 heralded Britain's emergence as the preeminent global power. France ceded Canada and all its North American territories east of the Mississippi. Spain, allied with France, relinquished Florida. Britain now commanded the eastern half of North America. and was the undisputed master of India. Yet, victory incurred a cost that would ultimately prove detrimental to the empire's cohesion. The war had indebted Britain by $140 million, surpassing the government's entire annual revenue. The national debt had doubled, and Parliament was desperate to procure new sources of revenue. The apparent solution was to levy taxes on the American colonies, which had benefited from British safeguarding during the conflict. The Stamp Act of 1765 mandated colonists to pay a tax on all printed materials, including newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, and even dice. This seemed reasonable to British politicians. The colonists ought to bear the cost of their own defense. However, the colonists perceived it differently. Lacking representation in Parliament, they questioned Parliament's authority to tax them. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry of American resistance. What commenced as a disagreement over taxes escalated into a constitutional crisis, then into armed insurrection, and finally into a war for independence that would dismantle the empire. The American Revolution signified Britain's initial major imperial catastrophe, but it was also a formative experience. The forfeiture of the 13 colonies transcended a military defeat. It represented a profound psychological shock that compelled the British to reconsider their entire approach to empire. The antiquated system of governing colonies through local assemblies and traditional elites had failed. The new system would be predicated on direct rule, professional administration, and overwhelming military might. The empire that arose from the remnants of the American Revolution would be more centralized, more efficacious, and more merciless than any preceding iteration. Yet, it would also be more fragile, sustained not by shared identity and mutual interests, but solely by fear and coercion. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, Britain confronted a pivotal choice that would shape the subsequent century of human history. It could retreat from empire, accepting the loss of America as evidence that distant territories were excessively costly and perilous to retain. Alternatively, it could redouble its efforts, utilizing the lessons gleaned from defeat to construct an even grander empire. Britain opted for empire. However, this nascent empire would diverge from its predecessors. It would be constructed not by settlers seeking new abodes, but by merchants pursuing new markets, not by soldiers conquering territory, but by administrators governing populations, not solely by the sword, but by the ledger book and the steam engine. The East India Company served as the proving ground for this novel form of imperialism. What had commenced as a trading endeavor had metamorphosed into something unparalleled in human history, a private corporation governing a populace greater than that of all of Europe. The company's personnel were not merely merchants. They were soldier administrators, individuals who engaged in warfare in the morning and balanced ledgers in the afternoon. In India, the company encountered a subcontinent embroiled in disarray. The Mughal Empire, once wielding magnificent authority over most of India, was disintegrating like a structure built on sand. Local rulers contended with each other for territory and influence, while French and English traders competed for commercial advantages. This presented a perfect opportunity for ambitious individuals possessing pliable morals and superior firepower. Robert Clive epitomized this nascent breed of imperial entrepreneur. A clerk turned soldier, he apprehended that in the modern world, commerce and conquest were inextricably linked. At the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Clive's diminutive force of 3,000 men vanquished the Nawab of Bengal's army of 50,000. Victory was not achieved through superior tactics, but through superior corruption, as Clive had bribed the Nawab's generals to defect at the crucial moment. The triumph at Plassey afforded the East India Company control over Bengal, India's wealthiest province. Suddenly, a trading company found itself governing 20 million people and collecting taxes from an area larger than Britain itself. The wealth emanating from Bengal would underwrite Britain's wars against Napoleon and finance the Industrial Revolution that was revolutionizing the British Isles. However, the company's triumph came at a severe detriment to India. The Bengal famine of 1770 claimed the lives of 10 million people, a third of the province's population. Company officials, prioritizing the extraction of maximum revenue for shareholders in London, had disregarded the warning signs of crop failure and persisted in demanding tax payments even as people perished in the streets. This encapsulated the dark core of the new imperialism. the dehumanization of individuals into economic units, the treatment of entire civilizations as sources of profit. The company's administrators did not perceive themselves as tyrants. They viewed themselves as rational managers applying scientific principles to the business of governance. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of India, attempted to reform the company's administration and mitigate the most egregious abuses. Yet, he was contending with a system engineered for exploitation, not governance. Company employees received minimal salaries, but were expected to amass fortunes through private trade and corruption. The outcome was systematic plunder on an unimaginable scale. Upon Hastings' return to London, he was impeached by Parliament for his conduct in India. The trial spanned 7 years and became a national sensation, with Edmund Burke delivering speeches lasting for days, denouncing the company's atrocities against humanity. Nevertheless, Hastings was ultimately acquitted, and the system he had endeavored to reform remained unaltered. Concurrently, the Industrial Revolution was transmuting Britain into something unprecedented globally, a nation capable of manufacturing goods more rapidly and affordably than any competitor, then employing its naval supremacy to forcibly open markets worldwide. This was capitalism armed with gunboats, free trade enforced at bayonet point. Steam engines extracted water from coal mines, enabling deeper excavation and increased coal production. Steam-powered textile mills produced cloth at a pace exceeding armies of handloom weavers. Steam locomotives transported goods across the country with unprecedented speed, and steam-powered ships liberated Britain from reliance on wind and weather, facilitating year-round navigation to every corner of the globe. The transformation was evident everywhere. Manchester, once a tranquil market town, evolved into a roaring industrial metropolis of cotton mills and smoking chimneys. The air was thick with soot, the rivers flowed black with industrial waste, and the workers inhabited slums that astonished even seasoned observers. But the mills operated day and night, producing cloth that outsold traditional craftsmen universally. British factories could produce goods so cheaply that they decimated local industries across the globe. Indian weavers, who had once supplied fine cotton cloth to the world, found themselves unable to compete with machine-made textiles from Manchester. The irony was acute. Indian cotton was shipped to Britain, transformed into cloth, then resold to India at prices that obliterated the local textile industry. This process, involving the extraction of raw materials from colonies and their subsequent sale as finished goods, served as the bedrock of the imperial economic system. Australia's contribution was wool, Canada's was timber, the Caribbean's was sugar, and India provided cotton and indigo. All these resources underwent processing in British factories and were then distributed globally, generating substantial profits. The Royal Navy rigorously enforced this system with unwavering effectiveness. British warships patrolled every ocean, safeguarding British traders and intimidating potential rivals. The Navy's objective was straightforward: to ensure open sea lanes for British commerce and, when necessary, restrict them for others. The Opium Wars with China vividly illustrated this operational framework. The Chinese Empire, proud and self-sufficient, showed minimal interest in British manufactured items. While the Chinese possessed coveted goods such as silk, tea, and porcelain desired by Europeans, they perceived no necessity for European products in return. This imbalance in trade led to a depletion of British silver reserves. However, British merchants discovered one commodity that Chinese consumers earnestly sought: opium cultivated in British-controlled India. The illicit drug trade proved immensely lucrative.